Hey guys, since the last time we met, first I have to tell you, I do have a cold. No, I do not have COVID-19. You can probably hear the congestion in my voice, and every once in a while I may cough, but have no fear, it is not COVID-19. As I said, I do have a bit of a cold, probably stemming from my allergies, which are going crazy at this time of year. But I hope you guys are all still doing well. But we need to pick up where we left off with our plant conversation. And the last thing that we were talking about in the previous video was the plant tissues and the plant organs. And if you remember, we went through the 4 types of plant tissues. You have the vascular tissue, you have the dermal tissue, you have the ground tissue, and then you have the meristematic tissue or the meristem tissue. And those 4 tissues combined make up the 3 main organs of plants, which are the roots, the stems, and the leaves. The roots, if you remember, anchor the plant into the ground and they absorb water and minerals from the soil. The stems serve as a support system for the leaves, and they also serve as a passageway for the water and minerals as well as the food to move throughout the plant. And then you have the leaves, okay, which its main function is photosynthesis. Now, because photosynthesis is the main job of plants, we're going to spend some time today talking about the leaves. Okay, if you remember, the leaf had different parts to it. They had the blade, which is the flat portion of the leaf. You have the petiole, which is the stem-like structure that attaches the leaf to the stems of the plants. And then you have the node, which is the little notch where the leaf is attached to the stem. But today we're going to do an in-depth study of leaves. Okay, there's a lot of information when it comes to leaves. And because leaves are the site of photosynthesis in plants, it's very important that we take a look at leaves. Okay, the diagram that you see there on this slide gives you there are 2 types of leaves. You have your simple leaf, which is what a lot of plants have, and then you have your compound leaf. And they're actually very easy to pick out, very easy to spot. A simple leaf has 1 blade attached to a node, and a compound leaf has several little blades attached to a node, and those little blades are called leaflets. Okay, so you have your simple leaf and you have your compound leaf. So 1 blade versus several little blades called leaflets, distinguish between the 2. Here you can see a lot of interesting information about leaves, the different types of veins that they have. You can have net-like veins on leaves. You can have parallel veins on leaves. The different shapes of leaves. You can have the hand shape, and hopefully you guys recognize that looks like a maple leaf. You can have a spear-shaped leaves. You can have heart-shaped leaves. You can have round leaves. You can have needle-like leaves. And arrangements on leaves, you can have a simple arrangement. You can have the compound arrangement where it's in like a circle there, or you can have the compound arrangement, which looks like our previous diagram with our bunch of different leaflets attached to 1 node. The edges of leaves can be smooth, they can be toothed, they can be lobed. And then, of course, the arrangement on the stems, how leaves are arranged on stems of the plant, you can have alternate, you can have opposite, and you can have whorled arrangement of leaves, okay? Those are pretty self-explanatory. And actually, believe it or not, the veins, the shape of the leaf, the arrangement of the leaf, the edges of the leaf, and the arrangement of the leaves on the stem actually tells you a lot about the type of plant that you actually have. Now, we will get into that because I still would like for you guys to do a leaf project, in which case these are certain things that you have to identify for me as far as your leaves are concerned. But when we get into that leaf project, I'll get into a whole lot more detail about that, okay? Now, here you have a cross-section of the leaf. And if you remember, this means if you cut the leaf up and down, and you picked it up and you were looking at it directly from looking at the inside of the leaf, this is what you would see. All right, and I did attach a copy of this diagram. I put this on the class page, so that way, hopefully, you can use it to take notes on for this particular part of our discussion of leaves, because there's a lot of interesting information and a lot of important information that we're going to be covering that just has to deal with this one diagram. All right. But if you look at the very top portion of the leaf, you see the cuticle, if you remember, is the waxy coating that prevents water loss in plants. And you have the upper epidermis, which is the upper side of the leaf. That's the shiny part of the leaf, the upper side of the leaf. If you look at the bottom of the diagram, you see the lower epidermis. Now that is the rough part of the leaf. That's not shiny. It does have a cuticle, but it's not shiny. It's a very rough side of a leaf, okay? But you have the cuticle, the upper epidermis, and then the lower epidermis. Now everything that's inside there is what's the most important and what we're going to be talking about. All right. First of all, you can see on the the left-hand side of this diagram, it shows you the vein. And then on the right-hand side of this diagram, it has the vein broken into the bundle sheath cell, the xylem, and the phloem. That's the important thing for you to understand about the veins, is that is the vascular tissues. Okay? There's the xylem, which brings water and minerals up from the roots, and then the phloem, which takes the sugars back down through the rest of the plant. All right? Now, the key thing we want to look at today is those palisade mesophile cells and the spongy mesophile cells. That is the ground tissue that's inside the leaves. That is where photosynthesis actually takes place. And primarily, most of the photosynthesis takes place in the palisade mesophile cells. And if you look, that's directly underneath the upper epidermis. All right, well, if that's the upper epidermis, that's the side that's facing up towards the sun. So it makes sense that the palisade mesophile cells, the layer, would be underneath the upper epidermis. Now, photosynthesis does occur throughout the spongy mesophile cells, but not as much as in the palisade mesophile cells, because that is where the sunlight is hitting directly, the upper side of the leaf. The spongy mesophile, they are just irregularly shaped, kind of scattered throughout the rest of the inside of the leaf. Remember, the ground tissue supports the vascular tissue, so that's primarily what the spongy mesophile cells do, is it provides support for the veins, which of course includes the vascular tissues. But notice the palisade mesophile cells, they're very organized. They're arranged in a certain fashion. Okay, and that's again because that's where primarily all the photosynthesis takes place, inside the inside of the leaves. All right. Now on the bottom, in the lower epidermis, I want to draw your attention to the left-hand side of the diagram where it shows you guard cells, and then it shows you stomata. Okay. The stoma or the stomata, they're the same thing. Stoma is singular, I believe, and stomata is plural. But those are openings on the underside of leaves. They're like pores. And the guard cells open and close the stoma, okay, to allow for gas exchange. So that's where the oxygen is going to be released from. That's where the carbon dioxide is going to go in. So the guard cells, they are the protective cells around the stomata, and they regulate the opening and closing of the stomata. All right? But again, the stomata is where gas exchange occurs. There's also something called transpiration that occurs in the stomata of the cells. And transpiration is the water and how water is released from the cells. Or from the plant, excuse me. All right, transpiration is also something that occurs through the stoma or the stomata in the leaves. And if you look at this diagram, it shows the process of transpiration. You can see water moving into the roots from the soil, all right, and it replaces the water that's constantly moving up the stems and evaporating through the stomata of the leaves, okay? Water is lost through evaporation, through open stomata, and it's constantly being replaced. It's a constant cycle. Water comes in, moves up the plant, and then it leaves through the stomata as water vapor. Now, how plants function. Well, there's two things that happen, all right, with a plant and how it functions. And the first one is called capillary action. And capillary action is how water moves through the plant. As water evaporates, the molecules move out the molecules moving out tug on the molecules below it and pull it up, and that's the process of transpiration. How water evaporates, leaves through the stomata, and continuously gets replaced. If you remember from chemistry class last year or 2 years ago, you probably learned about capillary action with water. Water is a polar molecule, and it means, remember, it looks like Mickey Mouse, and it has those partially positive ends and partially negative ends that attract them to one another. Water likes itself very much, okay? And you can see in that diagram there on the lower right-hand side of the slide, it shows you the water molecules and how it pulls itself up through skinny things. This is how water moves through straws, how you can have a plastic straw in a glass of water, and then the next thing you know, you have a puddle of water next to the glass of water because the water comes up through the straw. And because water likes itself so much, it pulls on itself, all right, and it attaches itself very tightly. That's why it takes a very high temperature for water to boil, because the water molecules like themselves so much that they really hold tightly to one another. But that's one way that plants function, is through this capillary action, which is what's responsible for transpiration. Okay? And the loss of water is responsible for water movement. As water evaporates through the stomata, okay, it means just more water is being pulled through the plant. Another way that plants function is through the process called translocation. And translocation is how sugars or food move from the leaves down to the rest of the plant. The carbohydrates, of course, get made in the leaves, but then they get moved to areas of active growth, and the rest gets stored in the stems. Carbohydrates, if you remember specifically glucose, which is a product of photosynthesis, is the primary energy molecule for all living things. And plants produce their own glucose, and so they produce their own energy. And so the carbohydrates get moved from the leaves down to areas of active growth, which, if you remember, is at the root tips and in the stems, okay? And then the rest of it gets stored throughout the plant, and that's what plants will live on throughout the winter, especially plants such as trees. They don't die. They lose their leaves. So if their leaves aren't there, how are they supposed to be performing photosynthesis, and how are they supposed to be making their own food? Well, it's because they stockpile all these carbohydrates during the spring and the summer and the early fall, when the leaves are green and the sun is shining bright. And then that way, then during the winter time, late fall and all through winter, when they don't have any leaves, they're able to continue to grow and to survive and thrive with all the carbohydrates that they have stored throughout the body of the plant. All right? Hopefully, guys, that makes sense. And the next video that we will be looking at after Easter is going to be solely about flowering plants. We're going to be looking at the flower, and we're going to be talking about the parts of the flower, and we're going to talk about the process of pollination and plant reproduction in that respect. But until then, have a happy Easter. Try to enjoy yourself as much as possible, and hang in there.